There's nothing I enjoy more than heading into ripoff land. Of course, some of our biggest horror icons have a litany of imitators, and Freddy is no exception. I've already done one roster of knockoffs, but there's plenty more. So let's check out another round of 9 or 10. Never Sleep Again. Number 10. We're kicking off back in 1989 with something called Trampa Inferno, or rather, Hell's Trap from Mexico. It begins with some teens playing paintball and this guy's pretty rad perm mullet. Permullet, one word. There's a news article about a bunch of hunters that were killed by a bear attack, and the macho dude challenges Permullet to go there and find it. They agree to the bet and head out there, but their girlfriends insist on coming along. The locals seem to warn them about going out there, but they set up camp anyway, and right now you're saying, none of this feels like Nightmare on Elm Street, but just you wait. Because very soon we're introduced to our killer, and it's not a bear after all. It's a man wearing a mask. And yeah, right now it's teens camping in the woods while a masked man is stalking them. So this could very easily go under a list of Friday the 13th ripoffs, except for this. The killer has a weapon, and that weapon is a glove full of knives. Sure, his is made up of what looks like little bear trap bits as opposed to Freddy knives, but the dude even wears it on the same hand and clacks it together the same way. Considering his face is basically just a human face but white, you could probably lump this into Halloween ripoffs as well. So this movie is basically just saying, we're gonna take a little bit out of everything. As like most movies of this type, the legend of the killer is told around a campfire, and there's stories of an old Vietnam vet said to be lurking who has lost his mind, and very quickly he makes his presence known and goes on the attack, leaving our group to figure out a way to survive. And this one is by Pedro Galindo III, and he's done a string of silly horror and comedy flicks in Mexico, and also did the second part of the Vacation of Terror films, which are a ton of fun, and also feature Pedro Fernandez, who is also rocking the permullet in those movies. And yeah, outside of the glove, there's really no nightmare in this, but I had to put it on here just for this glove. I mean, look at it. Overall, though, it's a pretty fun flick, although also lightweight stuff that you've seen before, but I still find it entertaining. Number 9. This next one came out as Freddy Mania was starting to wane, but was still going strong, and it's 1988's Deadly Dreams. And you can get an idea of where this is going based on the title. It's Christmas time, and little Alex here witnesses his parents getting killed by a disgruntled employee wearing a wolf's mask before shooting himself. Years and years later, he's now grown up and is a struggling writer who is still haunted by images of the killer. He confides in his friend Danny and also his older brother Jack, who was also there that night. Jack wants him to join him in the family business, and his dreams start to escalate. Alex talks about how he's read that if you die in your dreams that you don't wake up, and he's become concerned that Perkins' ghost is stalking him in those dreams and trying to finish the job he started all those years ago. Things start to get weird when he starts dating Maggie, and she seems to escalate his dreams, which start to include blades being shoved up through the mattress, Freddy style. But his brother has been acting nutty and being overly aggressive towards him. Also, Danny is a little unhinged himself, pointing guns at him and having one of those wolf masks. And soon, reality and dream worlds are starting to mix. But wow, what's going on here? Is this Perkins really getting a dream world revenge? Or are the people in Alex's life working against him? And this one was by Christine Peterson, and this was her directorial debut, although she had worked as a first assistant director on a bunch of films, including Nightmare on Elm Street 5, which she did right after working on this. Afterwards, she'd do the erotic thriller Body Chemistry, and then launched the career of Leonardo DiCaprio with Critters 3. It's got Troy Evans as a cop, and I would be willing to bet that 1 out of every 3 roles he played were cops. And also, Perkins is played by Dwayne Whitaker very early on in his film career, although he had done a bunch of TV before this. It was low budget and didn't get a theatrical release, and instead going straight to video, where it did okay, but never really became like a hit or anything. As far as Elm Street links go, it's clear that it wanted to draw parallels to the idea of Freddy as the dream killer coming back for revenge, but this movie is definitely more than that. It's well scripted, with nice characters, and is a solid little ride. Number 8. It's time to get wacky because we're headed over to Hong Kong for the film The Vampire is Still Alive, otherwise known as Counter Destroyer or Counter Destroy, and also Robo Vampire 3 from 1989. Two women encounter a Taoist and watch his ceremony, but they're warned that spirits lurk there and want to find a live body to inhabit. They're renting out this old spooky house because Joyce here is planning to write a horror movie script, and right afterwards, strange things start to happen. And of course, one of those strange things is this man with a burnt up face, a hat, and yep, finger knives. But there's also a couple of Jiangshi here, Chinese hopping vampires. But then, of course, there's also a local crime syndicate and kidnappings. But here's the thing, if you're trying to follow the plot, you've got your work cut out for you because it tends to jump between several different stories and characters that don't seem all that related to each other. But rest assured that some of them involve martial arts battles. Oh, and fortune-telling birds for some reason. And yeah, plots 2 and 3 or whatever have nothing to do with Freddy, but every time that we cut back to Joyce and her friends, they're haunted by Kmart Ruger, and several shots are lifted straight out of Nightmare. And this one is from a director that has been on ripoff lists before, and it's Godfrey Ho. And I featured his film Robo Vampire on a list of RoboCop clones. Most of Ho's films revolve around gangsters and ninjas, and clearly parts of this follow suit, but then there's more supernatural stuff going on here than usual. Sure, there's been vampires before, but they usually act like regular vampires attacking, and this one adds the surreal element of things to cash in on that dream stuff. But like, instead of professional burn makeup, there's this guy with wadded up cotton balls all over his face. It's pretty bad. It's loaded with a handful of humorous bits, mostly unintentional, but probably not enough to sustain the runtime. If anything, it's probably worth watching for the finale alone, where Joyce's friend shows up, spins around like Wonder Woman, and then turns into that RoboCop suit to fight the Freddy vamp. And Joyce spontaneously becomes pregnant and gives birth to a fully grown child Jiangshi that then fights the other ones. And I think I'm telling you that like it's gonna make you like run out and see it, and I don't know, maybe you will. Number 7. This next one is down under, as we're still in the late 80s and looking at Kadaicha, which was also called Stones of Death. It begins with a scene that's very familiar, and a woman having a dream about an aborigine, and when she awakens, something from her dream is there. She tries to tell her friends, but they don't believe her, and her teacher says that the stone from her dream is a Kadaicha stone, and if you were given one, it means that you've broken tribal law and were marked for death. We also meet a divorced dad with a teenage daughter, and he's getting back into the dating pool. And then there's swing sets with no one on them, and Tracy is attacked by a dog and killed. The next day at Kangalula High, which is the coolest name for a school, period, they discuss her death and that crystal. But then, another student has woken up with one, and it said that the entire housing plan was built on an old Aboriginal graveyard. So I guess this is a bit of a Poltergeist ripoff too. As they research on it, they find that the area was cursed by an Aboriginal chief, the Kadaicha, and a killer spider claims the next stone holder. Although from what I gather, every bug in Australia is trying to kill you, so this doesn't seem like so out of the ordinary. But of course, we continue to get bits with the school students in the dream world, which look as much like Freddy's realm as possible, and the curse passes from person to person. Their deaths are pretty much all animal related because we had that dog, the spider, and then there's a killer eel, which ties more into the social commentary that they're bringing up here. And with that, it's more like it's dipping a bit into Wolfen territory, since there's a number of similarities there as well. And it's by James Bogle, and this was his feature debut. Later, he'd go on to do more dramatic fare and a bunch of Aussie TV. The original idea for it was to have it be a theatrical release, but skipped it and went straight to video instead. And like I mentioned, it's a mix of a bunch of things, but based on the dream element, it's clear that they were dipping into Elm Street territory, particularly considering the way those segments are filmed. Number 6! Next up is another one from the same general time frame, and it's 1987's Slaughterhouse Rock, which has a dreamlike opening of a man chained up to a wall while someone stalks him. It turns out to be a dream that Timu Rufus Sewell is having, and in case the idea of dreams wasn't enough to put it here, look at the school they go to. Yep, this is John Marshall High School, where the OG Nightmare was filmed, as well as around a million other things. He tries telling his buddies about the dreams, but they don't believe him, and neither does his brother. His visions start to intensify, and he starts seeing things in restaurants and also at school, which starts to worry everyone around him. And for good reason, since he almost burned to death in his bed. He plays with the thing from My Science Project, and there was like this really brief period of time where these were everywhere, and everyone thought that they were insanely cool. And you know what? They were right. Those things are badass. His teacher takes an interest in his stories and tracks one of the images he sees to Alcatraz Island, and she recommends that he goes to face them down. At first, he's hesitant, but then when he straight up starts bed floating, they all decide to head out there to stop what's happening. They arrive with the teacher accompanying them, but things get weird when a ghost appears, and she's so fine. In fact, she's so fine, she blows my mind. She says that there's a demon loose on the island, gaining power by claiming souls through dreams, and hey, that sounds familiar, and she wants to help to stop him. And I kid you not, this movie has a demon rape scene that's immediately followed up by an upbeat dance number from Tony Basil. But then, yeah, all hell breaks loose, including some fun practical transformation stuff, as it gets less nightmare influenced and away from the dream stuff. And this was the second feature for Dimitri Logothetis, and it's probably his only horror flick because most of the rest of his work is action-oriented. It's a lot like Stones of Death, and it seems to be like taking a bunch of different movies in order to build a whole thing here. And once they get to Alcatraz, it doesn't feel much like Elm Street anymore, but the influence is clear. It's mostly fun, although it does feel a little directionless, but it's probably worth checking out. Number 5. Speaking of mishmash ripoffs, let's go on now to 1992's Hellmaster, and it was also called Soul Stealer, and Them. It's got Flyboy in it, and he's on the case of a weird cult, and is visited by some ghouls. There's then a college class and a bunch of students who are participated in this experiment where they're asked a series of questions, and some of the students have been having odd experiences after going to the local chapel. Nearby, a young woman and her daughter are pursued by some sort of scar-faced creature that doesn't really seem to bug the kid much. Like really, she seems barely worried. A bunch of the students have some tension between them, and their professor seems to have something to hide, and that something seems to be of interest to MG's reporter from the intro. It seems a while back the church caught fire and killed a number of students, and the reporter talks about a Jones cult from 20 years ago. However, it seems that Jones is still around, and what do you know, it's Nancy's dad, and he has some sort of serum with him. Everything has that nightmare lighting scheme going on, and the Freddy influences become more obvious as we get better looks at our villain, with his very Krueger-looking face and penchant for smart-ass comments. But, considering that it also seems to throw out some religious platitudes here and there, it looks like they're dropping in a touch of Hellraiser to boot, or maybe even some Prince of Darkness given the setting. It's by Douglas Scholes, and it was his first film, but he would later go on to do Mimesis and Mimesis Nosferatu, both films that would be greatly influenced by other horror flicks, although those would wear their influences a little more on their sleeve. I should point out that there's also a side villain in Mama Jones, an evil nun, and she's played by none other than Ron Ashton, member of the Stooges. I'd say that overall there's a number of different influences on hand here, but in the end, you're casting Nancy's dad to play a wisecracking villain whose face is all burnt up, so I'm putting you on a list of Nightmare on Elm Street ripoffs. And yeah, it's somewhat enjoyable, but not great, although it is worth a watch. Number 4. Now it's time to look at something a little more blatant as we now look to 1991 and check out Dream Stalker. And come on, with that title alone, you know what you're getting into. It's shot on glorious video, and we meet Brittany and her motocross riding beau. And she's a model, and they're so in love. He gets her this cursed thing, and if someone gives you this for a gift, just run, okay? She then goes to New York on what is the quietest plane in the history of air travel.
Brittany?
But she has a vision of Ricky crashing and dying. But, uh-oh, turns out that it was real after all. But then she keeps having these dreams of Ricky on a motorcycle coming after her and dragging her into the ground. They persist, so she pokes that clown, which makes it glow or something, and afterwards is then haunted in her dreams by dead Ricky, who ghost molests her. And guess what? Yep, his face is all burnt and scarred, and he throws out one-liners. Of course, he starts attacking people in the real world, which Brittany can see in her dreams. I mean, even the music is a direct ripoff. When Brittany rents out a cabin to get away, she meets a new fella who also has a sort of a mullet, much like Ricky did. But the Rick's not all bad, since he takes out a couple of guys that also try to grope Brittany. I guess he's like, no one gets to sexually assault her but me? Or does he? Or is this all in Britt's mind? And is Ricky even evil in the first place? I guess we'll have to ask Christopher Mills, since he directed this one, and he only directed 3 things, and this was his first. Oddly, the second film was from 1998 and was also called Dream Stalker, although it was a different plot and less nightmare influence. Seems at one point he shifted away from directing and focused more on sound work, and has since been in the audio department of a ton of high-profile gigs, including a number of Marvel projects. This one was obviously done on a super low budget and clearly takes some inspiration from Freddy, but also doing its own thing, because it's constantly up in the air if what you're seeing is reality or dream, and it doesn't really hold itself to its own rules as much as it has them. When you watch the film, there's no director listed in the credits, and I guess this is because there was a dispute between Mills and the producers, and his name was taken off of it, although there's not much information out there regarding the details of that. But, all in all, this has some fun going on, even if it's so weirdly uneven and all over the place, but there's a distinct charm to its cheapness that I kinda dug. Number 3. Well, this one is on this list under protest, but I'll talk about it in a bit, because we're covering 1984's Dreamscape. This begins with a dream about nuclear war, dreamt up by some guy who probably has a pig somewhere. Then Brewmeister Smith is here, as is that Klingon, Chang, and also Willie Scott. They're looking for a guy who has a bunch of mental powers, and he's Michael Brody 3.0, and he's always on the run from people hunting him down. And 2 of those people are Peter Jason and Chris Mulkey, who pull him into the project. Seems they're working on a way to enter into other people's dreams and even alter them. He's not really up for it, but is convinced by Novotny to join up, where he flirts with Jane, and also meets up with fellow test subject T-Bird. They test it out, and Alex goes into a dream of a construction worker and falls to his death, but wakes up before impact. And they discuss that if you die in the dream, you also die in real life. Alex also meets Buddy, who has a recurring dream of a giant snake man trying to kill him. Seems that Blair is the one that's actually in charge of the project and tells the president that he's able to help him out with his little nightmare issue. And that's where the intrigue starts, as it seems like there's more to reality than anyone is expecting, and the risks are all too real. And there's clearly no parallels here to Nightmare on Elm Street, considering it's all about dream creatures and their ability to inflict harm in the real world, as well as the ability to enter into other people's dreams and team up with them, making sure to enlist the help of Norm along the way. And when I last did an episode about Elm Street ripoffs, several people mentioned this film as one that should have been included. Plus, several online lists mentioned this film as something similar. However, this was released several months before Nightmare on Elm Street, so it's clear that it's not what you would call a ripoff. It's interesting that there's so many similarities between the two sagas, and they seem at least partially thematically linked, but are diametrically opposite in terms of tone. This is clearly a more adventure and sci-fi approach to the whole thing, although as soon as they get to the nightmare sequences here, it feels more horror. It was directed by Joseph Rubin, and his roster is a little all over the place. He did the comedy film Gorp, but also this, and also the more horror-oriented The Stepfather. But then, also the Macaulay Culkin flick The Good Son. But more interesting than that was one of the writers of the film was Chuck Russell, who would of course later go on to write and direct Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So yeah, this isn't a ripoff of Nightmare, and is in fact could sort of be called a forerunner. And who knows, maybe even a side story. Like maybe there's room for a team-up fan film showdown between Freddy and Alex. Number 2. This one's kind of funny because at first you may be like, huh? But it's 1989's The Phantom of the Opera. It starts off in the modern day, and we're in New York and meet the stepfather's stepdaughter, and she goes on to see her friend Meg, who's some sort of superstar. And this was actually Molly Shannon's very first acting gig, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Meg has found a rare old concerto from a lost composer that was said to be also some sort of serial killer, and she takes it to use for her audition. However, as she's performing, a sandbag comes loose and bops her on the head, and she awakens back in 1885. And she instantly recognizes Meg, but we don't, because she's now a different actress. And again, we'll come back to it. Christine doesn't seem to remember her future life, and is now simply the Christine from the classic Phantom story, and the understudy to a famous diva. But then, of course, there's a Phantom, and this one stitches up his own face. But when we get a good look at him, what do you know? It's Freddy himself, Robert Englund, and he's already up to no good, killing at the opera. Of course, he's also taken a fancy to Christine, who wants her to be the star of the show, and it mostly follows the plot of the OG Phantom. But there's a twist here, and that this guy was a composer who made a deal with the devil. But the hook is that the world will love him only for his music, and his face will be hideously deformed. So, clearly, this plot doesn't have much to do with A Nightmare on Elm Street, right? So what's it doing here outside of having Robert Englund involved? Surely that alone doesn't make it a ripoff, right? Well, not really, but keep in mind that this one came out at the height of Freddy Krueger mania. This was '89, and Englund was basically known as the horror guy to go to, and was cool with being covered with lots of makeup. Their intentions were very clear from the fact that they cast Englund, and then they made the Phantom facial design look as similar to Freddy as they could. Like, sure, it's not a constant look, but when he's fully revealed, it sure does look like our guy. In fact, they were banking so hard on the connection that pretty much all of the marketing revolved around it. The poster proudly had Englund's name at the top and proclaimed that he was Freddy, really big next to an image of his partially exposed face, looking even more like the Krug than he does in the film. Since the Nightmare series was slowing down a touch, they wanted a new horror franchise and a new horror character, and they were banking on this one so hard that they changed the movie to set up a sequel. They altered the beginning to bring the action into present day, but since either Emma Rawson wasn't available for the reshoots or they just didn't like her performance, Molly Shannon was brought in to play the present day version of Meg. The second part was meant to be called Terror in Manhattan, but when this film bombed at the box office, they scrapped it. There's talk that the 1992 film Dance Macabre, which also featured Englund, was a modified version of that script, and Fangoria even reported on that. But the Freddy star himself said that's not true, and no version of that script was shot, and he would have loved the sequel. It was said that the chances of it ever being made are unlikely. Number 1. Okay, I hope you're ready for this next one, because now we head back to 1986 for Satan's Bed. Not to be confused with the film from the 60s with Yoko Ono. No, this one starts in 1941 on Christmas, and a massacre via gunfire. And I don't know why these people are so upset. It's just a mass shooting. Oh yeah, this is 1986, where this sort of thing didn't happen every other day. Much later, another family has moved into that same house, and they've been noticing some odd occurrences around. Maria has also been complaining about nightmares, and oh look, little girls jumping rope. Where have we seen that before? And then, when she decides to take a bath, well, this happens, and it's also very familiar. And then, they have a party at a friend's house, and this happens.
What are you frightened of?
And yeah, you can tell by now that this is pretty much just a remake of Nightmare on Elm Street, but in Indonesia. But of course, this is our version of Freddy here. But yeah, he even does the finger chopping thing. But instead of pulling his face off, here she takes off of his whole damn head. Did I mention that her character's name is also Tina? So it's got the ceiling thing going on, but then it switches thing up when the Rod character doesn't get killed in prison and instead escapes, but then encounters an alluring woman before being slashed up. But then there's also magic battles, which is something Wes Craven is probably like, damn, why didn't I put that in there? But yeah, the big difference here is that these aren't burnt up child killers, and instead are ghosts from the intro scene, who are Dutch, by the way, for some reason. But yeah, this was from Indonesia. It was directed by Jut Tjali, the same man who directed the amazing Mystics in Bali and would later do the Terminator ripoff Lady Terminator. And what's particularly funny is that by the ending of this one, it shifts a little more into ripping off Poltergeist than it does Elm Street. But considering just how much is lifted here, this is our biggest ripoff on this list. I will say, though, that compared to Mystics and Lady T, I found this one a touch slower and not as non-stop entertaining, but it was still a pretty damn good time. So there you have it, 10 more movies that rip off a Nightmare on Elm Street, some a little bit more blatant than others, and one that, isn't really a ripoff because it came out before it. But yeah, a lot of these were a lot of fun. I enjoyed most of these. There was a couple of stinkers in here, but for the most part, this was a good watch through. Let me know if you've seen any of these. Let me know if you would like to now see these. And tell me other Nightmare on Elm Street knockoffs that you know of and that you'd like to see on a future volume of these. Tell me that down below in the comments. I want to hear it. Also, if you enjoyed the video, give it that big thumbs up. Give it a like. If you like the channel, subscribe to it and hit the bell and get notified when new videos come up. And also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, and you can help support this channel like these awesome people do here. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching the video, and I will see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.